Have you ever considered what it means to be abnormal? Is this abnormal? What about this? How about this? By what definition are you deciding whether they are abnormal? Hey everyone, welcome back to Bear It In Mind. On this channel we explore the world of psychology so that we can better understand ourselves and others. This video is the start of a series exploring the topic of psychopathology. Psychopathology is the study of psychological disorders. In this topic, we're going to explore definitions of abnormality, where we learn about how abnormality may be diagnosed, characteristics of phobias, depression and OCD. We'll look at the signs and symptoms of these conditions. Then we'll look at explanations and treatments of phobias, explanations and treatments of depression, and explanations and treatments of OCD. In this video, we're going to explore the first section, definitions of abnormality. One question that arises when we consider psychological disorders is how do we identify when someone is psychologically unwell? And this is an important question because one, we want people who are psychologically unwell to be diagnosed so that they can be helped. And two, we don't want people who are psychologically well and healthy to be diagnosed as abnormal. Psychologists and health professionals have put forward different definitions of abnormality in an attempt to develop our understanding of abnormal behaviour. And we're going to explore 4 key definitions, and it's important for you to be able to 1. Explain the definition, 2. Have an example of the definition, and 3. Be able to evaluate the definition in terms of its strengths and limitations. Having said all of that, let's dive in. Our first definition of abnormality is statistical deviation, also known as statistical infrequency. This definition focuses on how infrequent abnormal behaviour is, how rare the behaviour is. If it doesn't happen very often, then it's considered abnormal. But how then do we decide if something is rare or infrequent? How do we measure or decide this? Well, in this case, it is done numerically by looking at statistics and normal distributions. Now, before you disappear, switch off or freak out at the sound of statistics and normal distributions, bear with me. A normal distribution simply shows the spread of data. For example, if we measured intelligence, height, or even shoe size, you should find that most people are average. In other words, if the average shoe size for a male is a size 9, most males are around that size. On a normal distribution, it would look like this. Notice that a normal distribution is symmetrical and forms a bell-shaped curve. The majority of the scores are located in the middle. They would be the average, or what we would call for this topic, what is normal. Whereas the very few people at the extreme ends, well, they would be considered abnormal. Why? Because they're rare, they're infrequent. Only a small percentage of people have that shoe size. Specifically, they are more than 2 standard deviations away from the mean. Let's take another example. The average IQ, a measurement of intelligence, is approximately 100. 68% of the population have an IQ in the region of 85 to 115. Furthermore, 95% of the population have an IQ between 70 to 130. However, a small percentage of people have an IQ below 70, or in the case of people like Albert Einstein, above 130. And that means that Albert Einstein is statistically rare, statistically infrequent, and therefore would be classified as abnormal according to this definition. Now let's discuss this definition. First of all, the statistical deviation definition has been praised for being objective. Objective simply means that it is not influenced by personal feelings or opinions. This definition has clear guidelines, clear cut-off points that are decided numerically, not by anyone's interpretation or opinion on a person's behaviour. They are either statistically infrequent or they aren't. This means that different mental health workers can all view the same kind of behaviour in the same way. They are using the same measurement, or what is called a standardised measurement. This is really important because it reduces any subjectivity, any personal interpretations and feelings when defining abnormality, and as a result makes it more accurate. Secondly, however, one problem with this definition is that it could define someone as abnormal when they are not psychologically unwell. In other words, some abnormal behaviour is desirable. For example, having a high level of intelligence wouldn't be considered a problem. Albert Einstein was thought to have an IQ way above 130, but whilst his abilities are statistically rare, Albert Einstein didn't require any treatment for his exceptional intellect. Therefore, it could be argued that this definition of abnormality is limited because it can view healthy, desirable behaviour as abnormal. Lastly, a further criticism of this definition of abnormality is it misses or excludes a range of serious mental health disorders. This is because some disorders are not statistically rare but relatively common. For example, according to the Office for National Statistics in the UK, in 2019, rates of depression were at around 10%, 1 in 10 people. That is certainly not statistically infrequent or rare on a normal distribution. In fact, rates of depression during the COVID-19 pandemic have doubled. They are just below 20%. That's 1 in 5 people. Therefore, it could be argued that we should be cautious when using this definition of abnormality, and perhaps it should not be used on its own to make a diagnosis because it could lead to certain behaviours being missed. Our second definition of abnormality is deviation from social norms. This definition considers abnormality from the point of view of what behaviours are socially acceptable. This means that if someone behaves in a way that does not fit within what society expects as normal behaviour, then it will be considered improper or indecent. For example, if you turned up to work in your flip-flops, beach shorts and sunglasses every day, unless you're a lifeguard, then your boss is likely to call you in for a chat. In essence, if someone breaks the societal expectations, they are considered abnormal. These expectations can be explicit. Sometimes these are written, explicit, and form laws that govern behaviour. For example, the COVID pandemic included restrictions on how many people you could meet with. Sometimes it's implicit. Sometimes these norms of behaviour are unwritten. They're implicit, but generally accepted. For example, not standing too near to someone at the cash machine, or joining an orderly queue rather than skipping to the front. Let's look at a few other examples. When members of the royal family last visited New Zealand, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle performed the traditional Maori greeting of rubbing noses. If they were to do this back in the UK to, say, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, this might be considered very abnormal behaviour, although it is Boris, so... Now let's discuss this definition. Firstly, deviation from social norms is flexible. This is because what is considered to be abnormal adapts to what societal norms are and not by a strict number like statistical infrequency. For example, as we saw earlier, high intelligence or genius will be considered statistically abnormal by our first definition, but most societies wouldn't want to include that in their definition of abnormal behaviours. Unlike our first definition, statistical infrequency, deviation from social norms is flexible enough to take this into account. Therefore, it could be argued that deviation from social norms is more useful than the statistical infrequency definition. However, it should be mentioned that as a flip side to this point, deviation from social norms loses the objectivity that statistical infrequency benefits from, due to the subjective nature of having to decide exactly when someone's behaviour is deviated from social norms enough to be considered abnormal. People within society differ greatly on their ideas of what is socially acceptable or not. Therefore, it can be argued that this makes this definition less accurate because it's open to opinion and interpretation. A further limitation of this definition relates to culture. Because this definition of abnormality is based on what society deems as acceptable, this means it can differ from culture to culture. More specifically, this definition has been criticised because it can lead to cultural bias. This is because a person from one cultural group may label someone from another culture as behaving abnormally according to their standards, rather than the standards of the person behaving that way. This is known as ethnocentrism. This means that one culture is used as the standard by which other cultures are judged and evaluated. For example, research by Fernando in 1998 found that people from Afro-Caribbean heritage in the UK are 7 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Fernando stated that this is a, quote, category failure. This means that the category of abnormality, in this case behaviours such as visions, hallucinations and religious experiences that are being interpreted as abnormal, are because a category based on mostly white European culture is being applied to people's experiences and norms from another culture. According to the Mental Health Foundation in the UK, in general, people from black and minority ethnic groups living in the UK are more likely to be diagnosed with mental health problems, more likely to be admitted to hospital, more likely to experience a poor outcome from treatment, and more likely to disengage from mainstream mental health services, which leads to social exclusion and a deterioration in their mental health. It's suggested that this may be because mental health services often fail to understand or provide services that are acceptable and accessible to non-white British communities and meet their particular cultural and other needs. Therefore, it can be argued that the deviation from social norms definition is limited because of the problems that can arise when defining abnormality across different cultures. Our third definition of abnormality is the failure to function adequately. Failure to function adequately refers to someone who is unable to cope with the demands of everyday life. David Rosenhan and Martin Seligman in 1989 decided on 7 criteria to determine when someone is not coping. Examples of these include 1. Personal distress. This is about the amount of distress a person experiences in response to their behaviour, thoughts, or situation. And secondly, irrationality, when a person's behaviour becomes irrational or dangerous to themselves or others. For example, someone with a hoarding problem might live in unhygienic conditions where they could get ill. Or depression can involve having a very low mood, reduced levels of energy, and making them lethargic. This can then lead to sufferers tending to withdraw from work, education, and social life, and as a result, they may be considered to not be functioning adequately as they're struggling to cope with the demands of everyday life. Now, let's discuss this definition. One of the strengths of this definition of abnormality is that it takes into account a person's subjective experiences. This means that it considers an individual's personal experiences, emotions, and feelings of their behaviour. Whilst this might be a problem when it comes to assessing distress, it does at least acknowledge the experiences of a person, something that other definitions, like statistical infrequency, fail to do. In that case, a person is simply viewed as a number, and whether they are normal or abnormal depends on where they appear on the normal distribution. However, one of the problems with this way of defining abnormality is that many forms of abnormality do not actually stop people from functioning in their everyday life. For example, forensic psychologists know all too well that there are criminals who commit crimes and who feel no distress or anxiety at all. Their behaviour is clearly abnormal, but does not affect their ability to function. As a result, these types of behaviours would go undiagnosed according to this definition. Our fourth and final definition of abnormality is deviation from ideal mental health. A different way to look at abnormality is to ignore the issue of what makes someone abnormal and instead look at what makes anyone normal. Once we have an idea of what good psychological health is, then we can begin to identify who deviates from this ideal. We define physical illness by looking at what is different from ideal physical health, e.g. correct temperature, blood pressure, so why not do the same for mental illness? Marie Jehoider in 1958 suggested the following criteria that need to be met if we are to be considered in good mental health. And in order to remember each of these, just think of a spear. A. Accurate perception of reality. This means having an objective and realistic view of the world, including themselves. S. Self-actualization. This means fulfilling their potential, experiencing personal growth, and becoming what you are capable of becoming. P. Positive attitude to oneself. This means having high self-esteem and a strong sense of identity. E. Environmental mastery. This means you have the ability to meet the varying demands of day-to-day life. A. Autonomy. Being independent, self-reliant, and able to make personal decisions. In other words, you have the ability to make your own decisions based on what is right for yourself, rather than to satisfy others. R. Resisting stress. Having effective coping strategies and being able to cope with everyday anxiety-provoking situations. For example, here we could see that if a student was hearing voices in their head that were happening often and were usually threatening, and in addition these voices made it difficult for them to complete work and meet deadlines, resulting in poor grades, this might be considered abnormal, firstly due to an inaccurate perception of reality in hearing voices, and secondly due to their inability to fulfill their potential and become what they are capable of. Now let's discuss this last definition. One limitation of this definition of abnormality is that it has an unrealistically high standard. This is because probably none of us meet all the criteria at once, nor maintain them for very long. For example, a person might not be experiencing personal growth, but they may be happy with their situation. It could also be argued that just because someone is not self-actualizing and showing personal growth, that does not mean they are suffering from a mental disorder. A further limitation of this definition is that it's ethnocentric. There's that word again from earlier. This means that one culture is used as the standard by which other cultures are judged and evaluated. The criteria used in the ideal mental health definition are based on a westernized, individualistic culture. Individualistic cultures like the UK and the USA place their emphasis on the self, on personal achievement, whereas collectivist cultures, typically India, China and Japan, put the emphasis on the group identity and achievement and what is best for the community. Jehoida's emphasis on personal growth and individual autonomy reflects the westernized individualistic view and not collectivist cultures. Therefore, it could be argued that this definition should be only used in the culture in which it has been developed. So, now you have a better understanding of different definitions of abnormality and an understanding of the strengths and limitations of each. If you would like more information relating to mental health, whether to help you or others, do check out the links in the description for some helpful online resources and support services. Comment below about any other examples you've come across that might illustrate each of the different definitions. I find with my students it's helpful to share other examples that we might know of which can help others better understand the definitions. For more relating to psychopathology, check out this next video on the signs and symptoms of phobias, depression or OCD. See you in the next one.